Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following program is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. The data, historical trends, and case studies discussed regarding demographic changes and marital laws do not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Marriage and divorce are complex legal processes that vary significantly by state jurisdiction and individual circumstance. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with a qualified attorney or licensed professional before making any decisions related to personal, legal, or financial status. Imagine standing in a crowded room in the year 1900. Out of every 1,000 married women in that room, only 4 would ever see the inside of a divorce court. Now fast forward to today. That number has nearly quadrupled, but the story isn't as simple as a straight line pointing up. In fact, if you look at the raw data from the last decade, divorce rates in the United States are actually plummeting to 40-year lows. We are living through a demographic paradox. We are more likely to divorce than our great-grandparents, yet we are less likely to divorce than our parents. Something fundamental has shifted in the American psyche. The very definition of a successful life has been rewritten, and the fallout is visible in our census data, our tax codes, and our empty suburban bedrooms. This deep dive solves a critical problem for the modern American viewer: the confusion surrounding the death of the family narrative. Today, we are going to look past the headlines to understand the actual historical trends that govern your life, your taxes, and your future. We are documenting the structural evolution of the American home over the last century to show you exactly why we stopped marrying young, why the 1980s was the great splitting, and what the current decline in divorce actually means for the stability of the next generation. This is the masterclass on how we became the most decoupled nation in history, and where the data suggests we are headed next. To understand the present, we must go back to a time when divorce was not a choice but a scandal. In the early 20th century, the legal framework of the United States was built on a fault-based system. This meant that if you wanted to end a marriage, you couldn't just cite irreconcilable differences or a loss of love. You had to prove a specific, legally recognized transgression. We are talking about adultery, extreme physical cruelty, or willful desertion. In many states, if both parties agreed they wanted a divorce, the court would actually deny it under the doctrine of collusion. The law was designed to be a cage, and the demographic data of the 1920s reflects that. The divorce rate sat at a mere 1.6 per 1,000 people. But even then, the seeds of change were being planted. World War I had ended, and the 1920s brought a brief spike in marital dissolution, as soldiers returned to a world that had moved on without them. However, the first massive documented shift occurred during and after World War II. If we look at the year 1946, we see a massive spike. The divorce rate jumped to 4.3 per 1,000. Why? Because the war had fundamentally disrupted the traditional household. Women had entered the workforce in record numbers, gaining a taste of economic independence that the Census Bureau had never seen before. When the men returned, the friction between the new woman of the 1940s and the traditional expectations of the 1930s created a demographic explosion. However, the most significant turning point in this century-long journey didn't happen in a bedroom or a factory. It happened in a governor's office. In 1969, Ronald Reagan signed the California Family Law Act. This was the birth of no-fault divorce. For the first time, a spouse could walk into a courtroom and say, "This isn't working," and the state would grant the dissolution without requiring a villain. The impact was immediate and staggering. Between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rate more than doubled. It reached an all-time historical peak in 1980, with 22.6 divorces per 1,000 married women. Case studies from this era show that the divorce revolution wasn't just about people wanting out. It was about the legal system finally catching up to a society that had already changed. Women were entering the labor force at unprecedented rates, and as their economic power grew, their reliance on a single breadwinner diminished. But here is where the deep dive gets counterintuitive. If you listen to the news, you might think divorce is still spiraling out of control. The data says the opposite. Since that 1980 peak, the divorce rate has been on a long, steady decline. By 2022, the rate of women experiencing divorce fell to roughly 14.6 per 1,000. Why is this happening? It isn't because marriages are getting happier, in the traditional sense. It's because the demographic at the highest risk for divorce, young lower-income couples, have stopped getting married altogether. We are seeing a class dive in American demographics. Modern data shows that those with a bachelor's degree or higher have significantly lower divorce rates, around 16% for ever-married women, compared to those with only a high school education, around 22%. Marriage is becoming a luxury good. People are waiting longer to wed, often until their late 20s or early 30s, after they have established their careers. This delayed entry into marriage is a primary driver of the declining divorce rate. When you marry at 32 instead of 19, your financial stability is higher, your brain is fully developed, and your potential outcomes for a lifelong partnership improve statistically. The demographic shifts also reveal a stark racial and ethnic divide. Ever-married Black women, for instance, have seen the largest rise in separation and divorce, peaking at 35% in 2010 before settling slightly lower in recent years. Conversely, Asian American communities maintain the lowest rates of marital dissolution, with only about 10% of ever-married women being separated or divorced as of 2022. These are not just numbers, they are reflections of varying economic opportunities, cultural pressures, and the availability of desirable partners within specific socioeconomic pools. We must also address the gray divorce phenomenon. While younger generations are divorcing less, those over the age of 50 are divorcing at rates that have doubled since the 1990s. This is a massive demographic shift. The baby boomer generation, who came of age during the original divorce revolution of the 70s, are now reaching retirement age and realizing they have 20 or 30 years of life left, and they don't want to spend it with the person sitting across the breakfast table. This has massive implications for the U.S. economy, specifically regarding Social Security, healthcare costs, and the housing market, as one household splits into two smaller, more expensive ones. As we move through this 10-part series, we are going to analyze how these shifts influenced everything from the rise of the single mom as a political voting bloc to the collapse of the traditional department store. But it starts here with the realization that divorce isn't just a personal tragedy, it is a demographic engine. It reshapes cities, it changes how we tax income, and it dictates the psychological makeup of the next generation of American workers. By examining this century of change, we aren't just looking at broken homes. We are looking at a country that is fundamentally redefining what it means to be a unit in the 21st century. To understand how we arrived at this state of total redefinition, we have to look at the massive economic scaffolding that held the American marriage together for the first half of the 20th century. Imagine a woman in 1926 named Margaret. Margaret lives in a world where the law of coverture is only recently a memory, but its social ghost still haunts every room. In Margaret's era, marriage was not just a romantic choice. It was the primary financial institution for women. At this point in history, a woman's credit score did not exist, her ability to own property was often tied to her marital status, and her career options were largely limited to teaching or nursing until the day she said "I do." For someone like Margaret, divorce was not a path to freedom. It was a path to total economic annihilation. This created a demographic floor. The divorce rate remained low not necessarily because of marital bliss, but because the cost of exit was higher than almost anyone could afford. This brings us to the first major structural shift in our century of data, the Great Depression. Many people assume that hard times pull families apart, but the historical trends tell a different story. In the 1930s, the divorce rate actually dipped. This was not because couples were getting along better. It was because the filing fee for a divorce and the cost of maintaining two separate households was an impossible luxury during a period of 25% unemployment. We see here the first historical example of marriage as a survival mechanism. When the state cannot provide a safety net, the family unit becomes the only net available. This period cemented the idea of the nuclear family as a fortress, but it was a fortress under siege. Now, fast forward to the post-war boom of the 1950s. If Margaret's daughter, Joan, gets married in 1952, she enters the golden age of the American housewife. This is the era that modern traditionalists often point to as the gold standard of stability. But if we look at the case studies of the time, we see a boiling pressure cooker. The 1950s saw the average age of marriage drop to an all-time low. Women were marrying at 20, men at 22. They were moving into the newly minted suburbs, fueled by the GI Bill and a manufacturing economy that allowed a single breadwinner to buy a 3-bedroom home and a station wagon. However, the demographic data from this era reveals an invisible crack. While the divorce rate remained relatively stable around 9 per 1,000 married women throughout the 1950s, the rate of desertion skyrocketed. Men who could not afford a legal divorce would simply walk out, leading to what sociologists called the poor man's divorce. This highlights a critical lesson in demographic documentation. the legal rate of divorce does not always reflect the actual health of the union. It reflects the accessibility of the legal system. As the U.S. moved into the 1960s, the pressure within that suburban pressure cooker finally reached its limit. The 1960s and 70s represent the most violent demographic shift in our 100-year timeline. To understand why, we have to look at the convergence of three massive factors: the birth control pill, the surge of women into higher education, and the legislative shift toward no-fault divorce. Imagine a woman in 1974 named Susan. Unlike her grandmother Margaret or her mother Joan, Susan has something revolutionary: a separate checking account. It was not until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 that banks were prohibited from requiring a husband's signature for a woman to get a credit card. This single piece of legislation did more to increase the potential outcomes of divorce than almost any other economic factor. Once a woman could secure her own credit, lease her own apartment, and build her own financial identity, the cage door was unlocked. This period saw the divorce rate climb a literal mountain. In 1960, there were roughly 393,000 divorces in the U.S. By 1981, that number had surged to over 1.2 million. We have to look at the step-by-step reality of what this did to the American landscape. Suddenly, the two-parent household was no longer the statistical certainty of the middle class. We saw the rise of the blended family, the step-parent, and the latchkey kid. This era created a massive demand for new types of housing. The suburban dream of the 1950s was built for families of 5. The reality of the 1980s was a demand for apartments and smaller units as families fragmented. But as we move into the 1990s and early 2000s, the data takes a strange, quiet turn. The divorce rate begins to slide downward. If the 1970s was the era of the Great Splitting, the 1990s was the era of the Great Hesitation. We began to see the rise of cohabitation without marriage. In 1960, cohabitation was virtually non-existent in census data. By the year 2026, it is a standard stage of the relationship life cycle for the majority of Americans. This shift is vital because it effectively filters the marital pool. People who would have divorced in the 1970s are now simply breaking up in their 20s before a marriage license is ever signed. This brings us to a concept called the marriage divide. In 2026, we see that marriage has become highly correlated with education and income. For those in the top 20% of earners, marriage is more stable than it was for their parents. They are marrying later, often with too high incomes, and they are using their combined resources to outsource the stresses that used to break marriages apart. They hire childcare, they pay for therapy, and they have the financial cushion to weather economic downturns. Conversely, for those in the lower income brackets, marriage has become increasingly fragile or altogether unattainable. The decline in well-paying manufacturing jobs for men without college degrees has disrupted the traditional male breadwinner model, but the cultural expectation for that model often remains. When the economic reality does not match the cultural expectation, the union often dissolves or never starts. This has led to a demographic divergence where your zip code and your tax bracket are now the strongest predictors of whether your children will grow up in a two-parent household. Case studies in 2026 show that the U.S. is currently experiencing a plateau. We are no longer in the chaos of the no-fault revolution, but we are also not returning to the rigid stability of the 1950s. We have reached a point where the individual's desire for self-actualization often outweighs the institutional pressure to remain in a substandard union. This shift toward individualism has transformed the very nature of the American contract. We no longer view marriage as a permanent merger of two families, but as a renewable contract between two individuals. But what happens when this contract ends in the modern era? The legal and financial implications have evolved far beyond Margaret's worst nightmares or Susan's hard-won victories. In our current year of 2026, a divorce doesn't just mean splitting the house and the kids. It means navigating complex digital assets, cryptocurrency portfolios, and the long-term impact on retirement accounts that were never designed to be divided. The demographic changes we are documenting are now colliding with a technological and financial world that moves faster than the law can keep up with. As we look at the data, we have to ask, is the declining divorce rate a sign of healthier relationships, or is it a sign that marriage itself is becoming an elite institution, accessible only to those who have already won the economic game? If we are documenting a century of change, we have to acknowledge that the biggest change might not be how we leave marriages, but who is allowed to enter them with a reasonable expectation of success. This leads us to a massive looming question that is beginning to show up in the most recent census projections. As the traditional family unit continues to morph and the birth rate continues to fall alongside the divorce rate, we are seeing the emergence of a new demographic entirely: the permanent single. This isn't just about young people delaying marriage. It is about a growing segment of the population that is opting out of the contractual union altogether. What does a country look like when its primary unit of consumption and social organization is no longer the family, but the individual? And more importantly, how did the legal battles of the 1990s set the stage for the massive wealth transfer we are seeing today? To answer that, we have to look at the hidden architecture of the 1990s, the era of the high-stakes celebrity divorce and the rise of the prenuptial agreement as a mainstream tool. We are going to see how the battle for assets in the 90s paved the way for the current legal landscape of 2026, and why your grandmother's advice about marriage might be the most dangerous financial risk you could take today. The 1990s represented a massive shift in the American consciousness regarding the permanence of the marital bond. While the previous decades were characterized by the shock and awe of the no-fault revolution, the 90s were about the institutionalization of the aftermath. This was the decade where the United States began to treat divorce not just as a social phenomenon, but as a sophisticated legal and financial industry. If we look at the case studies of high-profile splits from this era, such as the widely publicized dissolution of the Trump or Spielberg marriages, we see the emergence of the prenuptial agreement as a household term. Before this, prenups were largely seen as tools for the ultra-wealthy or the cynical. By the late 1990s, however, the middle class began to realize that the potential outcomes of a standard divorce decree could be devastating without prior planning. Imagine a man named David in 1996. David is part of the first generation to grow up watching his own parents navigate the wreckage of the 1970s divorce boom. Unlike his father, who entered marriage with a handshake and a prayer, David enters his marriage with a wary eye on the statistics. He has seen how the equitable distribution laws, which vary wildly from state to state, can liquidate a lifetime of savings in a matter of months. In 1996, the demographic data shows that we had reached a steady state where nearly 50% of first marriages were projected to end in dissolution. David isn't being cynical. He is being a product of his environment. This era saw the rise of the specialized divorce attorney, the forensic accountant, and the child advocate as permanent fixtures in the American legal landscape. The 1990s also introduced a new variable into the demographic equation: the explosion of the dual-income household. In the 1950s, the court's primary concern was usually how to provide alimony to a displaced homemaker. By the mid-90s, the courts were faced with a much more complex math problem. If both spouses are earning six-figure salaries, how do you determine child support? How do you split a 401k that was contributed to by both parties but owned by one? We began to see a step-by-step professionalization of the breakup. The legal system had to evolve to handle the valuation of stock options, intellectual property, and professional licenses. This is where we see the historical trend shift toward mediation. Because the cost of litigating these complex assets was so high, the industry pivoted toward out-of-court settlements, a trend that has only accelerated into our current year of 2026. But there was a darker side to this institutionalization. The 1990s documented a significant rise in what researchers call the feminization of poverty in the wake of divorce. While the dual-income household was the ideal, the reality for many was that the mother still took the larger hit to her lifetime earning potential due to child-rearing. When the household split, the father's standard of living often rose, while the mother and children saw a sharp decline. This led to the Federal Child Support Enforcement Act of 1994, a massive federal intervention into what was once a purely state-level issue. The government realized that if it didn't force fathers to pay, the state would end up footing the bill through welfare programs. This was the moment marriage truly became a three-party contract: the husband, the wife, and the Internal Revenue Service. As we moved into the early 2000s, the demographic story took another turn with the arrival of the digital age. Imagine a woman named Sarah in 2005. Sarah is one of the first people to experience the impact of social media on the stability of the American home. Before the internet, if you wanted to find an old flame or a new distraction, you had to physically go looking for it. In 2005, with the rise of platforms like MySpace and eventually Facebook, the past was suddenly a click away. Demographic studies from this period began to cite the internet as a contributing factor in up to a third of all divorce filings. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the ease of exit. The digital world lowered the emotional barrier to leaving, just as no-fault laws had lowered the legal barrier. By 2010, the Great Recession had left its mark on the marriage data. Just like the Great Depression 80 years prior, the economic collapse of 2008 caused the divorce rate to temporarily dip. People simply could not afford to sell their homes at a loss to split the equity. We saw the rise of the separated but living together demographic couples who were emotionally finished, but financially shackled to a mortgage that was underwater. This period taught us that the American divorce rate is a lagging indicator of the American economy. When the housing market recovered, the divorce rate saw a brief, sharp correction as all those stalled filings finally hit the desks of judges. Now let's look at the landscape of 2026. The world that David and Sarah's children are entering is unrecognizable from the one Margaret lived in a century ago. We are now seeing the full maturation of the starter marriage. This is a documented trend where young couples marry in their early 20s, have no children, and divorce within 5 years. Because there are no children and few joint assets, these divorces are treated almost like the end of a long-term dating relationship. The demographic impact is significant because these individuals return to the single pool with their earning power intact, often going on to marry again in their 30s with much higher rates of success. This has contributed to the overall decline in the divorce rate. We are essentially practicing marriage and getting the failures out of the way before the high-stakes assets and children are involved. Furthermore, in 2026 we have to account for the impact of remote work on marital stability. Since the massive shift in 2020, more couples are spending 24 hours a day together in the same space. Case studies are showing that this is a polarizing force. For some, it has strengthened the bond, leading to a decrease in commuter divorces. For others, the lack of external social outlets and the constant friction of shared workspace has acted as an accelerant for underlying issues. We are seeing a geographic shift in divorce as well. People are no longer tied to the marital laws of the state where their job is located, but rather where they choose to live, leading to jurisdiction shopping, where individuals move to states with more favorable asset division laws before filing. The most fascinating demographic change in the last decade, however, is the rise of the silver splitter among the LGBTQ+ community. Since the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide in 2015, we now have over a decade of data on same-sex divorce. Interestingly, the data shows that same-sex female couples have a slightly higher rate of dissolution than same-sex male couples or opposite-sex couples. This has opened up entirely new fields of sociological study regarding how gender roles and communication styles impact the longevity of a legal union. It challenges the old patriarchal assumption that women are the glue of the household, showing that when two women are involved, the standards for emotional satisfaction are often higher, leading to a quicker exit if those standards aren't met. We are also seeing the emergence of unbundled legal services. In 2026, you no longer need to hire a lawyer for a $10,000 retainer to get a divorce. You can buy a divorce in a box, or use AI-driven mediation platforms that handle the asset split for a flat fee of $500. This has democratized the exit strategy. It means that the economic floor Margaret faced in 1926 has been completely dismantled. Today, anyone with a smartphone can initiate a legal dissolution of their marriage. This ease of access has fundamentally changed the power dynamic within the home. When the cost of leaving is low, the incentive to negotiate and compromise must be higher. As we look at these 100 years of data, we see a clear trajectory, from marriage as a social necessity to marriage as a personal luxury, and finally to marriage as a high-stakes financial merge. But as the divorce rate among the youth continues to fall and the age of marriage continues to rise, we are facing a new crisis that the Census Bureau is only just beginning to name. It isn't about the people who are splitting up, it's about the massive silent majority who are no longer showing up to the altar at all. What happens to a society when the legal institution of the family becomes so complex and so risky that the next generation decides the only way to win is not to play? In the next part, we are going to look at the marriage strike and the rise of the solo consumer economy. We will explore how the fear of divorce has created a trillion-dollar industry designed to replace the support system of a spouse. We are going into the heart of the loneliness economy and how your relationship status is being used to profile your spending habits in 2026. The transition from a marriage-centric society to a solo consumer economy is not just a social shift. It is a multi-trillion-dollar pivot in the American machine. To understand how we arrived here in 2026, we have to look at the economic vacuum left behind when a household of two becomes a household of one. Historically, the American economy was optimized for the family unit. Think about the classic 1950s supermarket. Large boxes, family-sized portions, and products designed for a stay-at-home mother to manage for a group. As the divorce rates of the late 20th century stabilized into a permanent demographic of single adults, the market had to adapt. Imagine a man named Marcus in 2026. Marcus is 34 years old, never married, and part of the growing demographic of Americans who live alone. In 1960, only 13% of American households were single-person. Today, that number has climbed toward 30% in many major metropolitan areas. For Marcus, every single aspect of his life is more expensive than it would have been for his married grandfather. This is what economists call the single tax. Without a spouse to split the mortgage, the utilities, or the grocery bill, Marcus spends a significantly higher percentage of his discretionary income on basic survival. But where there is a tax, there is also an industry. The loneliness economy has stepped in to provide the services that a spouse once provided for free. In the early 1900s, if you were sick or needed help with a household task, you relied on a partner or extended kin. In 2026, Marcus uses a subscription-based health concierge, a meal prep delivery service, and a task management app to hire strangers for assembly and repair. This shift represents a massive transfer of labor from the private, unpaid domestic sphere to the public, paid service sector. Case studies of the fast casual dining industry show that its explosive growth over the last 20 years is directly correlated with the rise in single-person households. The industry isn't just selling food. It is selling the convenience of not having to cook for one, which is historically inefficient. This brings us to the rise of the solo consumer profile. In 2026, data brokers and marketing algorithms treat your relationship status as one of the most valuable data points in their arsenal. If an algorithm detects a divorce or a long-term single status, your digital footprint changes. You are served ads for high-end travel experiences for one, small batch grocery subscriptions, and wellness products that emphasize self-care over family care. We have documented a historical trend where single consumers are actually more likely to spend on luxury goods and experiences as a form of social signaling or emotional compensation. This has created a massive incentive for corporations to cater to the single demographic, further decoupling the idea that a successful life requires a partner. However, the deepest change in this solo economy is found in the housing market. For decades, the U.S. housing supply was built on the assumption of the nuclear family. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a yard. But the demographic shifts of the last century have rendered this inventory obsolete for a large portion of the population. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of co-living spaces and micro-apartments. These are not just dormitories for 20-somethings, they are being marketed to the silver splitters, divorced retirees who have the equity from their suburban homes but no desire to live in them alone. The real estate market has pivoted from selling a home as a place to raise children to selling a home as a lifestyle amenity for the individual. Let's look at the step-by-step evolution of the wedding industry as well. Historically, weddings were a community ritual to merge 2 lineages. Today, they have become a peak consumption event. Paradoxically, as the divorce rate has fallen, the average cost of a wedding has skyrocketed. In the 1920s, a wedding was often a simple church service followed by a reception in a parlor. In 2026, the average American wedding costs tens of thousands of dollars. This high barrier to entry has contributed to the marriage strike. Many young Americans view marriage as something you do only after you have reached a state of financial perfection. They see the potential outcomes of a divorce and decide that unless they can afford the perfect wedding and the perfect house, the risk of the legal contract isn't worth the reward. This leads us to the concept of the relationship as an asset class. In 2026, many individuals are performing a cold, hard cost-benefit analysis. Imagine if a woman named Chloe is considering marriage. She looks at the historical trends and sees that while marriage can offer tax benefits and shared expenses, it also introduces a massive liability to her independent career and retirement savings. Unlike the 1970s, where women sought divorce for liberation, many women in 2026 are avoiding marriage for protection. They are choosing long-term cohabitation or LAT, living apart together, arrangements. This is a demographic where couples remain in a committed relationship, but maintain separate residences. This allows them to enjoy the emotional benefits of a partnership without the legal and financial entanglements of a joint household. The demographic documentation of 2026 shows that LAT is one of the fastest-growing relationship categories among professionals over the age of 40. It effectively bypasses the entire divorce industry. If there is no joint property and no legal contract, there is no need for a 5-figure legal battle. This trend is fundamentally altering the census data. We are seeing a rise in people who are technically single in the eyes of the law, but functionally partnered in their daily lives. This creates a massive challenge for the U.S. government, which relies on the marital status box to determine everything from tax brackets to Social Security survivor benefits. But what about the psychological impact of this solo consumer shift? As we replace human support systems with market-based services, we see a rise in what sociologists call the commodification of intimacy. In 2026, you can pay for a professional cuddler, a life coach to provide the encouragement a spouse might offer, or an AI companion designed to provide consistent emotional validation. These are not fringe services anymore. They are becoming part of the standard consumer basket for the modern American. The historical trend is clear. We are moving from a society based on mutual obligation to a society based on contractual services. The demographic fallout of this is a shrinking of the American family tree. As people marry less and divorce more selectively, the birth rate has fallen below replacement levels. The United States is facing a future where there are more people over 65 than under 18. This is the ultimate demographic change documented over the last century. The divorce revolution of the 1970s didn't just change how we end relationships. It changed how we start them, how we spend our money, and how we plan for a future where the only person we can truly count on is ourselves. But as we peel back the layers of this loneliness economy, we find a hidden driver that most people ignore. It isn't just about personal choice or the cost of a wedding. There is a specific high-stakes legal mechanism that was designed in the late 1990s to keep the economy moving even as families fell apart. This mechanism changed how child support and alimony were calculated, turning domestic life into a predictable line-item expense for the state. In the next part, we are going to dive into the secret math of the family court. We will look at how the formulas used to calculate the price of a breakup were actually designed to prevent the collapse of the U.S. middle class, and why these same formulas are now causing a massive wealth gap between those who stay married and those who don't. We are going to look at the winners and losers of the 2026 divorce economy, and the one specific financial mistake that most men and women make before they even file the paperwork. The math governing the American divorce is not designed for fairness in the way most people define it. It is designed for predictability and state-level solvency. To see this in action, we have to look at the 1988 Family Support Act. This was a watershed moment in the history of U.S. demographics. Before this act, judges had wide discretion to decide how much a non-custodial parent should pay. The result was a chaotic landscape where two people in identical situations could walk away with vastly different financial futures. The federal government stepped in because the growing numbers of single-parent households were straining the welfare system. They required every state to establish numerical guidelines for child support. This turned the family court into a giant calculator. Most states today use the income shares model. Let us look at a case study from 2026. Imagine a couple named Elena and Robert. Elena is a specialized software architect earning $200,000 a year. Robert is a high school teacher earning $70,000. In the eyes of the modern court, the child is entitled to the same standard of living they would have enjoyed if the parents had stayed together. The court takes their combined income of $270,000 and looks up a predetermined table to see what a family at that income level typically spends on a child. If that number is, say, $3,000 a month, the court then divides that obligation proportionally. Since Elena earns roughly 74% of the total income, she is responsible for 74% of that $3,000, regardless of who has the child on the weekends. This math has created a massive demographic shift in who initiates divorce. Historical trends show that as women's wages have risen relative to men's, the financial calculations of divorce have flipped. In 2026, we are seeing more cases where the high-earning wife is ordered to pay child support or even alimony to the lower-earning husband. This shift has changed the social fabric of the American professional class. It is no longer a given that the man is the financial anchor of the family, yet our legal formulas were originally built on the assumption of a male breadwinner. The friction between these 1980s formulas and 2026 economic realities is where most of the legal battles of today are fought. One of the most significant historical trends we have documented is the move away from permanent alimony. In the mid-20th century, alimony was often a life sentence for the payer. Today, in 2026, permanent alimony is nearly extinct in many states, replaced by what is called rehabilitative maintenance. This is designed to be a bridge, usually lasting for a period equal to 1/3 to 1/2 the length of the marriage. The goal is to provide the lower-earning spouse enough time to get the education or training necessary to become self-sufficient. This change has fundamentally altered the retirement projections of millions of Americans. If you are 55 and looking at a divorce in 2026, you can no longer assume you will be supported for life. You are looking at a hard countdown clock to financial independence. This brings us to the massive wealth gap that divorce creates over time. Longitudinal data from the last 30 years suggests that married individuals who stay together accumulate roughly 4 times the net worth of those who divorce and remain single. This is not just because 2 people can save more than one. It is because of the liquidation of assets during the split. When you sell a family home in 2026, you are not just losing a roof. You are losing the appreciation on that asset, the transaction costs of the sale, and the tax benefits of the primary residence exclusion. You are taking a single large appreciating asset and turning it into 2 smaller depreciating piles of cash. The specific financial mistake that most people make, the one that ruins their potential outcomes more than any other, is the commingling of separate property. Imagine if Elena received a $50,000 inheritance from her grandmother before she married Robert. In most states, that inheritance is separate property. But if Elena takes that $50,000 and puts it into their joint checking account to pay for a kitchen remodel, that money has been transmuted. It is now marital property. In the 2026 divorce court, Robert is now entitled to half of that inheritance. This mistake is so common because it feels like the right thing to do in a healthy marriage. You want to share. You want to build a life together. But the demographic documentation of the last century shows that the failure to maintain a clear line between what was yours before the marriage and what is ours during the marriage is the primary driver of unexpected wealth loss in a divorce. We also have to discuss the hidden tax trap of the modern era. In 2019, the tax laws in the United States changed fundamentally. For decades, the person paying alimony could deduct those payments from their taxes, and the person receiving them had to report them as income. This allowed a couple to shift the tax burden to the spouse in the lower tax bracket, effectively keeping more money within the 2 households overall. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act removed this deduction. In 2026, alimony is paid with after-tax dollars. This means the payer is taxed on money they do not even get to keep. This has made divorce significantly more expensive and has led to a historical trend of lower alimony awards, as the payer simply has less net income to share. Step by step, the U.S. legal system has squeezed the financial air out of the room. We see this in the rise of the pro-se litigant, people who represent themselves because they cannot afford the professional help required to navigate this math. In 2026, nearly 80% of family law cases involve at least one person without an attorney. This is a massive demographic shift from the 1990s when having a lawyer was the standard. This lack of representation often leads to people signing away their future Social Security benefits, or failing to realize that a pension earned during the marriage is a joint asset that must be divided. The winners in the 2026 divorce economy are not the spouses. They are the institutions that facilitate the split. But there is another group of people whose lives are being mapped by this math in ways we are only beginning to understand: the children. The demographic changes of the last century have created a generation of commuter children who live between 2 different economic realities. One house might have the high-earning Elena with her architect's salary, while the other house has Robert on a teacher's budget. The disparity in resources between the 2 homes of a single child is a relatively new demographic phenomenon that is reshaping how we think about social mobility and childhood development. But as we look at the spreadsheets and the tax codes, we are missing the most volatile part of the equation. Money is the language of the court, but custody is the language of the heart. And the way we divide time with children has undergone a revolution in the last 10 years that is even more radical than the no-fault movement of the 1970s. We are moving away from the every other weekend model toward a default of 50-50 shared parenting. But this new standard is crashing headfirst into the reality of the American workplace. In the next part, we are going to explore the rise of the equal parenting movement and why 2026 is the year of the custody war. We will look at how the shifting roles of fathers have created a new set of legal challenges, and why your state's default custody laws might be based on a version of the American family that hasn't existed since 1955. We are going to dive into the data of how 50-50 custody actually affects the long-term wealth of both parents, and why the mom versus dad dynamic is being replaced by a much more complex battle over time and geography. The legal and social battle for the custody of the American child has undergone a transformation so radical that it makes the financial shifts of the previous decades look like minor adjustments. To understand the custody war of 2026, we have to look back at the 19th century. Historically, children were considered the legal property of their fathers under English common law, which the United States inherited. If a marriage ended, the father almost always kept the children because they were seen as economic assets for labor. By the early 20th century, this flipped entirely with the tender years doctrine. This legal presumption suggested that during a child's formative years, roughly under the age of 7, the mother was uniquely qualified to provide care. This doctrine dominated the U.S. courts for decades, establishing a demographic where the father was relegated to the role of a visitor who appeared every other weekend. But the data of 2026 shows that the tender years doctrine has been dismantled and replaced by the equal parenting movement. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was fueled by decades of case studies showing that children with active, involved fathers have better emotional and academic potential outcomes. By the mid-2010s, states like Kentucky and later Florida, in 2023 began passing legislation that made 50-50 shared parenting the default starting point for any custody battle. Before these laws, a father had to prove why he deserved half the time. In 2026, the burden of proof has shifted. A parent must now prove why the other parent should have less than half the time. Imagine a man named Jason in 2026. Jason is a mid-level project manager who works remotely 4 days a week. His ex-wife, Sarah, is a surgical resident with a highly rigid and demanding schedule. In the 1990s, Sarah would have almost certainly been granted primary physical custody simply because of her gender and the prevailing social norms. In 2026, Jason's remote work flexibility makes him an ideal candidate for the 50-50 split. However, this creates a new kind of friction. Jason and Sarah now have to manage a complex handoff schedule that requires constant communication. The demographic data of the last 10 years shows a massive increase in the use of co-parenting apps. These platforms act as digital mediators, logging every message, every doctor's appointment, and every dollar spent on school supplies. In 2026, your co-parenting app data is often more important in a courtroom than your own testimony. The economic reality of 50-50 custody is also a major driver of demographic change in American housing. When a couple has a primary and visitor arrangement, they usually need one family home and one small apartment. When you have a 50-50 split, both parents need a home capable of housing children full-time. This means 2 bedrooms, 2 sets of furniture, and 2 sets of toys. This duplication of resources is incredibly expensive. We are seeing a historical trend where divorced parents are forced to live in closer proximity to one another than ever before. In many states, if you have 50-50 custody, you are legally restricted by a radius clause, often preventing you from moving more than 25 or 50 miles away from the other parent without a court order. This brings us to the geography trap. Imagine if Jason gets a job offer in 2026 that doubles his salary but requires him to move from Ohio to Texas. In a traditional primary custody world, the custodial parent often had a legal advantage in relocation cases. In the equal parenting world of 2026, Jason is trapped. If he moves, he loses his 50-50 status, which in turn increases his child support obligations and decreases his influence over his children's lives. This has created a demographic of stuck professionals. We are documenting a decrease in labor mobility among divorced parents. The legal system, in its pursuit of parental equality, has inadvertently created a new form of geographic stagnation. We also have to look at the rise of bird nesting as a case study for the extreme lengths parents will go to maintain stability. In this arrangement, the children stay in the family home, and the parents are the ones who rotate in and out. One week Jason lives in the house while Sarah stays in a small studio apartment, and the next week they swap. While this sounds ideal for the children, the data from 2026 suggests it is often a financial and emotional disaster for the adults. It requires the maintenance of 3 separate residences, the family nest, and 2 individual landing pads. It is an arrangement only the most affluent can sustain, further widening the gap between the marital winners and losers we discussed earlier. Furthermore, the shift to 50-50 custody has fundamentally changed the math of child support. As we noted in the previous part, many state formulas reduce child support payments as the non-custodial parent's time with the child increases. This has turned time into a commodity. In 2026, we see custody for cash battles where one parent fights for an extra day of the week, not because they want more time with the child, but because that specific threshold of overnights triggers a massive reduction in their monthly support payment. This has led to a professionalization of the custody battle, with parents hiring forensic schedule analysts to prove exactly how many hours the child spends under their roof. The demographic impact on women's careers in this 50-50 world is equally complex. On one hand, equal parenting theoretically frees up more of a mother's time, allowing her to pursue career advancement that was previously hindered by the motherhood penalty. On the other hand, for high-earning women, the loss of child support income combined with the continued expectation of managing the majority of the mental load of parenting can lead to significant burnout. Case studies in 2026 show that even in 50-50 arrangements, mothers are still the ones more likely to be contacted by schools for emergencies or to manage the extracurricular calendar. The law can mandate equal time, but it cannot yet mandate equal mental labor. We are also seeing a historical trend of parallel parenting. This is a strategy used by high-conflict couples where they essentially have no contact. They share 50-50 custody but have separate rules, separate clothes, and separate lives for the child in each house. This demographic shift is creating a generation of children who are masters of code switching. They navigate two different cultures and two different sets of expectations every week. Psychologists are only just beginning to document the long-term impact of this dual life upbringing on the generation that will reach adulthood in the 2040s. As we look at these 100 years of custody data, the pattern is clear. We have moved from children as property, to children as a mother's burden, to children as a shared project. But this project is becoming increasingly difficult to manage in an economy that demands total flexibility. The conflict between the rigid 50-50 legal mandate and the fluid 24/7 nature of the 2026 workforce is reaching a breaking point. But what happens when the battle isn't just about time or money? What happens when the state itself begins to intervene in the very values and education the child receives in those two different homes? We are seeing the rise of a new kind of legal dispute, the educational and medical decision-making war. In a world where parents can't even agree on basic facts, how does a 50-50 custody arrangement survive a disagreement over a vaccine or a school curriculum? In the next part, we are going to dive into the veto power crisis. We will look at how joint legal custody has become a weapon for parental gridlock, and why the 2026 courts are being forced to appoint parenting coordinators, who essentially act as private judges for the American family. We are going to explore the rise of the private family bureaucracy, and how your inability to agree with your ex is creating a new multi-billion-dollar industry of professional tiebreakers. To understand the gravity of the private family bureaucracy, we must first distinguish between the two types of custody that dominate the 2026 legal landscape. Most people confuse physical custody, which is where the child sleeps, with legal custody, which is the right to make long-term life-altering decisions. In 1926, these were almost never separated. If you had the child, you had the power. But as we move through our documented century of change, the U.S. courts shifted toward a default of joint legal custody. This sounds equitable on paper, but in practice it created a structural phenomenon known as the veto power. If both parents have equal legal rights, a single no can paralyze a child's life. Imagine a woman named Mia in 2026. Mia and her ex-husband Tyler have a relatively standard 50-50 physical custody split. However, they possess joint legal custody over their 10-year-old son. Mia believes their son needs a specific neurological assessment for learning disabilities, a move backed by his teachers. Tyler, however, views this as unnecessary labeling and refuses to consent. In a pre-1970s world, the parent with primary custody would simply make the appointment. In 2026, Mia cannot legally take the child to that specialist without Tyler's signature. If she does, she is in contempt of court. This is the gridlock that has birthed a new multi-billion-dollar industry of professional tiebreakers. Because the U.S. court system is chronically backlogged, a trend that accelerated after the legal surges of 2020 and 2021, judges no longer have the time to decide if a child should play soccer or baseball, or if they should attend a private charter school versus a public one. To solve this, the state has outsourced its authority to a demographic of professionals known as parenting coordinators, or PCs. A parenting coordinator is typically a high-level mental health professional or a family law attorney with specialized training. They are not just mediators. In many jurisdictions in 2026, they are granted quasi-judicial immunity and the power to make binding decisions on the spot. This is where the financial deep dive becomes sobering. A parenting coordinator in a major U.S. city typically charges between $300 and $600 per hour. If Mia and Tyler cannot agree on that neurological assessment, They are required by their divorce decree to meet with their PC. The bill for a single 2-hour session, plus the PC's time to review emails and write a formal recommendation, can easily exceed $1,500. This is the private family bureaucracy in action. It is a pay-to-play system of justice where the ability to resolve a stalemate is directly tied to your household's discretionary income. The demographic data of 2026 shows a historical trend where high-conflict divorce is becoming a significant drain on middle-class wealth. While the ultra-wealthy have always used special masters to manage their disputes, the middle class is now being forced into the same model. We are documenting a shift where the cost of a divorce is no longer a one-time exit fee, but a recurring subscription to a professional support team. Case studies indicate that for a high-conflict couple, the cost of maintaining a parenting coordinator over the course of a child's minority can rival the cost of a college education. Furthermore, we must look at how technology is fueling this bureaucracy. In 2026, the primary evidence in these disputes is no longer witness testimony. It is the data dump from co-parenting communication apps. These platforms have evolved to include AI-driven sentiment analysis. If Tyler sends a message that the algorithm deems aggressive or uncooperative, that data is flagged and sent to the parenting coordinator. We are seeing a historical trend where the digital footprint of a breakup is being used to build a profile of parental fitness. This has created a new level of surveillance within the American home. Parents are now performing for the algorithm, knowing that every text message is a potential exhibit in a tie-breaking hearing. The step-by-step reality of this system is that it often rewards the parent with the most patience and the deepest pockets. If Mia knows that Tyler cannot afford another round of PC fees, she may use the threat of a dispute to force a concession on a different issue. This is what legal scholars call litigation-funded parenting. It is a far cry from the community-based resolutions of the 1920s or even the simplified court orders of the 1980s. In 2026, the American Family Unit, once dissolved, becomes a small corporation managed by a board of directors that the parents have to pay for by the hour. This private bureaucracy also extends to the medical field. We are seeing a rise in the use of reunification therapists. These are specialized practitioners hired when a child becomes alienated from one parent during the divorce process. Again, the cost is staggering, and the potential outcomes are heavily dependent on the quality of the professional hired. The demographic shift here is clear. As we moved away from the mother always wins model of the mid-century, we introduced a level of complexity that requires a massive infrastructure of experts to navigate. But the most profound change documented in 2026 is the psychological impact on the children caught in this bureaucratic loop. Imagine being the child of Mia and Tyler. Every time your parents disagree on your summer camp or your dental work, a third-party stranger in a professional office makes the final call. The child grows up seeing the family not as a source of authority, but as a legal dispute that requires external management. This is creating a demographic of young adults who view all institutional contracts, including future marriages, with a high degree of skepticism. They have seen the secret math, they have seen the hourly rates, and they have seen how the state can effectively colonize the most intimate details of daily life. As we examine this century of change, we see that the decline in raw divorce rates we discussed in earlier parts is partially offset by the sheer intensity of the cases that do go to court. The couples getting divorced in 2026 are often the ones with the most to lose, which means they are the ones who fight the hardest. The family court has transformed from a place of social engineering into a high-stakes management firm. But while Mia and Tyler are fighting over therapists and summer camps, there is a much larger force at play in the background. The divorce industry is no longer just waiting for people to walk into a law office. It has gone proactive. In 2026, the way you are targeted by divorce professionals starts long before you ever consider filing. There is a hidden architecture of predatory marketing and predictive analytics that knows your marriage is in trouble before you do. In the next part, we are going to dive into the divorce industrial complex. We will look at how big data and social media algorithms are being used to identify unhappy spouses and funnel them into the legal system. We will explore the rise of the divorce retreat and the commodification of the emotional breakdown. We are going to see how your digital privacy is the last line of defense against an industry that views your heartbreak as a quarterly profit margin, and why the most dangerous thing you can do in 2026 is search for a marriage counselor on a public browser. The moment you type those keywords into a search engine, you are no longer just a person in a struggling relationship. You are a high-value lead in a sophisticated data ecosystem. In 2026, the divorce industrial complex has moved beyond the simple yellow pages listings of the past into the realm of predictive churn analytics. Just as a subscription service like Netflix or Spotify can predict when a user is about to cancel based on a decline in usage, data brokers now sell marital instability scores to the highest bidder. This is a demographic shift that is rarely discussed. The transition from private domestic struggle to a public, monetized transition. Imagine a woman named Amanda in 2026. Amanda has been married for 12 years. She is not yet sure she wants a divorce, but she is unhappy. She spends a late Tuesday night searching for topics like signs of emotional neglect, or how to tell if your spouse is lying about finances. In the background, her browser's cookies and her search history are being harvested. Within 48 hours, Amanda's digital experience shifts. Her social media feed is no longer showing her ads for home decor or vacation packages. Instead, she is served targeted content from life coaches specializing in feminine empowerment after 40, asset protection seminars for women in her specific high-income zip code, and sponsored articles about the benefits of a collaborative divorce. This is the industry funnel. It is designed to take the nebulous feeling of marital dissatisfaction and crystallize it into a legal action. Historical trends show that in the 1950s, a woman like Amanda would have sought counsel from a religious leader or a family elder, people with a vested interest in the stability of the union. In 2026, she is funneled toward professionals whose revenue models are built entirely on the dissolution of that union. This is not to say these professionals are predatory by nature, but the structural incentive is clear. A reconciliation earns a therapist a $100 copay, while a litigated divorce earns a legal team $50,000 in billable hours. We are also documenting a massive rise in the divorce retreat. This is a phenomenon where the commodification of heartbreak reaches its peak. In the 1940s, people traveled to Reno, Nevada, to take advantage of short residency requirements for a quickie divorce. They stayed in divorce ranches for 6 weeks. In 2026, the modern equivalent is a $5,000 weekend at a luxury wellness center in Arizona or upstate New York. These retreats are marketed as uncoupling intensives. They provide a combination of yoga, meditation, and crucially consultations with financial planners and legal experts. The marketing language bypasses the word divorce entirely, opting for terms like conscious evolution or sovereign transitions. This shift in vocabulary is a key demographic marker of the current era. We have successfully rebranded the failure of a legal contract as a mandatory step in personal growth. But there is a technical side to this industry that is far more dangerous than luxury retreats. In 2026, the digital paper trail is the primary weapon in the divorce economy. Historical trends in the 1990s focused on physical evidence, bank statements found in a drawer or photos from a private investigator. Today, the divorce industrial complex thrives on digital discovery. Forensic tech firms are now a standard part of the middle-class divorce budget. These firms specialize in pulling metadata from shared family cloud accounts. They look for hidden cryptocurrency wallets, deleted messages on encrypted apps, and even location history from smart home devices. Imagine if Amanda's husband, Mark, has been secretly moving small amounts of their joint savings into a digital asset account. In 2026, the software used by divorce attorneys can cross-reference Mark's bank withdrawals with the timing of his smartphone's location data at a known crypto ATM. The step-by-step reality of a modern breakup is a digital autopsy. This level of surveillance is so expensive that it has created a new class of litigation called discovery wars. The goal is often not to find anything, but to bankrupt the other side through the sheer cost of processing petabytes of personal data. This leads to a massive wealth transfer from the American household to the service sector. When we look at a century of divorce, we see that in 1926 the money stayed within the family, even if the family was broken. Today, a significant portion of a family's net worth, equity that could have gone toward a child's education or a parent's retirement, is siphoned off into the divorce industrial complex. Case studies from 2026 suggest that for a contested divorce involving a house and a retirement account, up to 15% of the total marital estate can be consumed by professional fees. This is a demographic drain on the national economy, as thousands of families each year lose their primary source of financial stability to the process of splitting it. Furthermore, we must look at the rise of divorce influencers. In 2026, social media is flooded with personalities who have built their entire brand around their own breakup. They provide advice on how to win the custody battle or how to hide assets, often skirting the edge of legal ethics. These influencers create an echo chamber where the potential outcomes of a divorce are portrayed as universally positive. This creates a cultural accelerant. When a person in a struggling marriage sees a curated, filtered version of a post-divorce life, the psychological barrier to exit is lowered. They are being sold a lifestyle, but the fine print, the years of litigation, the financial depletion, and the emotional toll on children, is rarely part of the content. The most subtle part of this complex is the role of insurance and corporate benefits. In 2026, some major U.S. corporations have begun offering divorce support as a part of their employee assistance programs. This includes legal referrals and mental health days specifically for uncoupling. On the surface, this is a progressive employee benefit. However, from a demographic perspective, it signals the total institutionalization of divorce. The workplace has recognized that a distracted, litigating employee is less productive, so they have integrated the divorce process into the corporate structure. It is the final stage of the transition. Marriage is no longer a sacred bond or even a personal choice. It is a life event that must be managed by your employer, your lawyer, and your algorithm. This brings us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. If the industry has become this efficient at facilitating the end of a marriage, what happens to those who have already gone through the process? We have spent a century perfecting the exit, but we are only just beginning to see the long-term impact on the most vulnerable segment of the population. As the baby boomer generation enters its final decades, the divorce industrial complex is pivoting toward a new, even more lucrative demographic. In the next part, we are going to explore the explosion of the silver divorce. We will look at why people who have been married for 40 years are suddenly calling it quits in 2026, and the devastating impact this is having on the U.S. healthcare system and elder care. We are going into the heart of the loneliness epidemic among seniors, and how the dissolution of long-term marriages is creating a massive crisis for the children of the 1980s, who are now being forced to care for two separate, aging households. We will look at the specific financial trap of the late life split, and why your parents' divorce might be the biggest threat to your own financial future. The gray divorce explosion is not a statistical anomaly. It is the logical conclusion of a century of rising individualism, meeting the reality of increased human longevity. In 1926, the average life expectancy in the United States was approximately 54 years for men and 58 years for women. Marriage was, quite literally, a commitment until death, which usually arrived before the couple could even contemplate the psychological nuances of an empty nest. Fast forward to 2026, and we are documenting a demographic where 65 is considered the onset of a vibrant second act. When you have 25 or 30 years of healthy life ahead of you, the prospect of spending those decades in a stagnant or high-conflict relationship becomes an unacceptable cost for millions of Americans. Historical trends show that while divorce rates for younger generations have stabilized or declined, the rate for those aged 50 and older has doubled since 1990. For those over 65, it has tripled. To understand the gravity of this, imagine a couple named Linda and George in 2026. They married in 1988, raised 3 children in a comfortable Illinois suburb, and successfully navigated the economic turbulence of the last 4 decades. In 2024, their youngest child moved out to start a career in Seattle. By 2026, the silence in their 4-bedroom house has become deafening. Linda and George aren't fighting over infidelity or hidden gambling debts. They are simply 2 people who have realized they no longer share a common language or a common vision for the future. This is the empty nest catalyst, and its demographic footprint is massive. In previous generations, the social pressure to remain married for the sake of the family legacy was the primary deterrent. Today, that pressure has evaporated. Case studies from 2026 indicate that adult children are increasingly supportive of their parents' divorces, often prioritizing their parents' individual happiness over the traditional family structure. However, this cultural liberation comes with a staggering financial and logistical price tag that many families fail to calculate until the ink is dry on the settlement. The financial trap of the late life split starts with the destruction of the economies of scale. When Linda and George divorce in 2026, their cost of living doesn't just double, it intensifies. They must now maintain 2 separate residences in an era of historically high housing costs and insurance premiums. The 3-bedroom family home, which was their primary vehicle for wealth accumulation, must often be sold to liquidate the equity. In a 2026 market, where interest rates have redefined affordability, neither Linda nor George may be able to buy a comparable property individually. They are forced into the rental market or into smaller, less appreciating assets, effectively capping their net worth just as they enter their most vulnerable years. Furthermore, we must address the secret math of Social Security and pensions. In the United States, a specific federal rule dictates that if a marriage lasted at least 10 years, a divorced spouse may be entitled to claim Social Security benefits based on their ex-spouse's earnings record, provided they are at least 62 and unmarried. This 10-year milestone is a critical demographic marker. We see a documented spike in divorce filings right at the 10-year, 1-month mark. However, for a couple like Linda and George, who have been married for nearly 40 years, the division of defined benefit pensions and 401k accounts is a zero-sum game. Under a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, George's pension, which was intended to support a single household, is sliced in half. In 2026, where inflation has eroded the purchasing power of fixed incomes, two people trying to live on half a pension each often find themselves sliding toward the poverty line. This brings us to the caregiver crisis, which falls squarely on the shoulders of the adult children. Imagine Linda and George's daughter, Emily, who is 38 years old in 2026. In a traditional marital trajectory, Emily would eventually have to care for her aging parents in a single location. She would manage one set of doctors, one pharmacy, and one household maintenance schedule. Because of the Gray divorce, Emily's labor is now doubled. She must navigate two separate apartment complexes, two different sets of health insurance complexities, and two distinct emotional landscapes. This is what researchers call the double caregiver tax. Demographic data from 2026 shows that adult children of divorced seniors spend 40% more time on caregiving activities than those whose parents remain together. This takes a direct toll on Emily's own career productivity and her ability to save for her own retirement, creating a multi-generational cycle of financial fragility. The health implications are equally documented and severe. Longitudinal studies show that divorced seniors have higher rates of chronic illness and a shorter life expectancy than their married counterparts. The reason is not just the stress of the split, it is the loss of the informal caregiver. In a marriage, a spouse is the first person to notice a new mole, a persistent cough, or a lapse in memory. Without that daily observation, health issues in the 2026 senior demographic are often caught much later, leading to more expensive and less effective potential outcomes. The loneliness epidemic, which the U.S. Surgeon General flagged as a public health crisis, is most acute among the silver divorcee population. Case studies in 2026 are also highlighting the rise of the predatory relationship. When a senior like George enters the dating market after 40 years of marriage, he is often financially wealthy but digitally and socially naive. We are documenting an increase in romance scams and predatory marriages where the goal is the diversion of the family inheritance. This creates a new layer of legal conflict for adult children like Emily, who find themselves in court not to settle their parents' divorce, but to seek guardianship to protect the remaining assets from a new, suspicious partner. The Gray divorce doesn't just end a marriage. It often marks the beginning of a decade of litigation over the fragments of a lifetime. Step by step, the U.S. healthcare system is also being forced to adapt. Assisted living facilities and nursing homes are seeing a shift in their census. In the 1980s, these facilities were largely populated by widows. In 2026, they are increasingly populated by the divorced. This changes the social dynamic of elder care and creates a demand for different types of housing units, moving away from shared suites toward individual studios, which again increases the cost of care for the family and the state. As we look at this century of change, we see that the American family has moved from a permanent unit of survival to a fluid arrangement of individual choice. The silver divorce is the final frontier of this movement. It represents the ultimate triumph of the individual over the institution, but it also reveals the hidden structural reliance we have on the family unit to provide the social safety net that the state cannot. Linda and George have their freedom, but they have also lost their buffer. Emily has her parents' happiness, but she has lost her own stability. This massive demographic shift in the senior population is the final piece of the puzzle in our 100-year documentation. We have seen how divorce moved from a rare scandal to a common midlife transition, and finally to a late-life revolution. But as we look toward the horizon of the 2030s and 2040s, we have to ask, what is the end game? We are currently living through the highest peak of individual autonomy in human history, but the data suggests that this autonomy might be leading us toward a systemic collapse of the very support structures that make that autonomy possible. In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to synthesize everything we have learned. We are going to look at the future of the American Union. We will explore the emerging contractual cohabitation models that are replacing marriage for Gen Z and beyond. we are going to look at the government's desperate attempts to incentivize marriage through the tax code of 2027 and why these measures might be too little too late. We will provide the final roadmap for navigating this decoupled landscape and the one thing you must do today to ensure that whether you are married, single, or divorced, you are not the one left holding the bill when the demographic clock runs out. The demographic clock is not just a metaphor. It is a ticking reality in the halls of the United States Treasury and within the bank accounts of every household. As we look at the horizon of 2026 and into the projected tax code changes of 2027, we see a government in a state of quiet panic. For a century, the American economy has been subsidized by the unpaid labor of the stable family unit. When that unit fragments, the state is forced to step in as the provider of last resort for childcare, elder care, and social support. To combat this, we are seeing the emergence of the Marriage Incentive Act projections for 2027, which aim to significantly widen the gap between the standard deduction for married couples versus single filers. But for a generation that has watched the 1980s splitting and the 2026 gray divorce explosion, a tax break is no longer enough to outweigh the perceived risk of the legal contract. Imagine a man named Leo in 2026. Leo is 27 years old, a digital native who has seen his parents navigate two separate high-conflict divorces. He is in a committed long-term relationship with Chloe. They share a dog, a lease, and a joint investment account for their travel goals. However, Leo and Chloe have made a documented, conscious decision to never sign a state-issued marriage license. Instead, they have hired a private mediator to draft what is known in 2026 as a comprehensive cohabitation agreement. This is not a prenuptial agreement because there is no marriage to precede. It is a private business contract that dictates exactly how their shared life will be liquidated if they decide to part ways. Leo and Chloe's agreement is 40 pages long. It covers things the 1926 court could never have imagined. It includes a specific buyout clause for the equity they have built in their shared rental-to-own apartment. It features a pet custody schedule that is legally binding and non-modifiable without mediation. Most importantly, it includes a digital asset clause that specifies who keeps the passwords to their shared streaming accounts, their joint social media brand, and their diversified cryptocurrency portfolio. This is the future of the American Union, the privatization of the marital bond. We are moving away from a one-size-fits-all state contract toward a bespoke, individualistic arrangement that treats a relationship like a startup. Now, let us look at the step-by-step reality of the proposed 2027 tax changes. The government is attempting to save marriage by making the singles penalty almost unbearable. In 2026, a single filer might pay thousands more in effective taxes than a married counterpart with the same income. Case studies from recent pilot programs in states like Utah suggest that these incentives do increase the marriage rate, but they do not increase marriage stability. Instead, they create a demographic of tax marriages, couples who marry for the immediate financial gain, but lack the social or emotional infrastructure to sustain the union. The historical trend suggests these marriages will likely hit the divorce courts by 2032, further fueling the divorce industrial complex we documented previously. The one thing you must do today to ensure you are not the one left holding the bill is the implementation of the annual relationship audit. In 2026, the most successful couples are those who treat their union with the same analytical rigor as a Fortune 500 company. This is a documented shift in marital behavior. Once a year, Leo and Chloe sit down with their financial planner and their relationship manager, a new professional role that has emerged to replace the traditional marriage counselor. They review their assets, their individual career trajectories, and their exit strategy. This may sound cold, but the demographic data proves that transparency is the only antidote to the wealth-stripping effects of a surprise divorce. By knowing the cost of the split before the split happens, you remove the sunk cost fallacy that keeps people in toxic situations, and you remove the discovery wars that bankrupt families. As we synthesize this century of data, the trajectory is undeniable. In 1926, we had high stability and low individual freedom. In 1976, we had low stability and high individual chaos. In 2026, we have reached a state of high-cost individual autonomy. We have successfully decoupled sex from marriage, marriage from child-rearing, and child-rearing from the home. The American unit is now the individual. The housing market of 2026 is responding by building adaptable units that can be easily split into two smaller dwellings. The insurance industry is offering divorce insurance that pays out a lump sum to cover legal fees if a marriage ends. We have turned the most intimate human connection into a managed risk profile. The relationship manager role is perhaps the most fascinating development in this new era. These professionals do not focus on love, they focus on logistics. They help couples like Leo and Chloe manage the mental load of their household through shared project management software. They ensure that the financial clean room, a strategy where premarital assets are kept in segregated, non-commingled accounts, is strictly maintained. This meticulous attention to detail is what allows modern couples to avoid the commingling traps that ruined previous generations. In 2026, being romantic means being legally prepared. The children of this 2026 landscape, the first true alpha-beta transition generation, are growing up in a world where the two-parent, one-home model is a historical relic seen in old movies. For them, family is a network of contractual obligations and digital schedules. This has created a demographic of hyper-pragmatists. They are less likely to experience the emotional trauma of the 1970s divorce boom because they never expected permanence in the first place. This managed expectation is the ultimate demographic change. We have traded the heights of romantic idealization for the safety of a well-drafted exit clause. Furthermore, we must address the solo security fund. This is a documented financial trend where individuals within a marriage or long-term partnership maintain a private, liquid account that is never disclosed to the other partner. While some might call this a secret in 2026, it is marketed as a form of self-insurance. It is the modern equivalent of the runaway money that women in the 1920s used to hide in coffee cans. The difference is that today, it is automated through micro-investing apps and hidden behind biometric security. It is the ultimate expression of the lack of trust in the permanent union. The roadmap for the next decade is clear. If you are entering a union, you must do so with a cold eye on the historical trends. View the state's marriage license not as a romantic gesture, but as a high-stakes legal merger with the most aggressive partner you will ever have, the government. Ensure your digital and financial clean room is intact. Understand that in 2026, your relationship status is a data point that is being tracked, analyzed, and monetized by industries you will never meet. But as we conclude this documentation of a century of divorce, a new question emerges on the horizon of 2030. As the birth rate continues its precipitous drop and the permanent single becomes the dominant voting bloc in America, we are seeing the first whispers of a loneliness levy, a potential government tax on those who choose to live alone, designed to fund the crumbling social security system that once relied on large families. How will the next generation respond to a state that tries to force them back into unions they have spent 100 years trying to escape? The battle for the American home isn't over. It is just moving from the courtroom to the tax code, and the next chapter of this demographic saga is already being written in the fine print of our digital lives.